The very first second I stepped into the restaurant, Mafia boss Adrian Moretti was already looking at me like I'd just dropped something dangerous right in front of him. When in reality, I was just wearing a wrinkled second-hand floral dress, a neon jacket, and a pair of heels with a dying soul to my cheap blind date. He was sitting at a VIP table surrounded by men in black suits, yet his gaze landed exactly on me, the worst-dressed girl on the entire block. I hadn't even had time to turn around and run when he stood up and walked straight toward me. "You," he said, his deep voice freezing me in place, "are right on time." I blinked. "Sorry, are you talking to me?" "Of course." He looked at me like I was the only choice he'd ever consider. No one else would dare dress like that for a blind date. I like that kind of recklessness. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. I thought you were just a normal guy." His smile was sharp as a clean cut. "No, I'm the head of an underground empire, and you just made my evening interesting." He pulled out a chair for me, perfectly calm, as if a mafia boss falling for a girl with the worst dress code in the room was the most natural thing in the world. "Tonight," Adrian said slowly, "you belong at this table mine." I wish I could tell you that I found some inner strength right then, some quick wit to throw back at him. But honestly, all I could feel was the heat of 100 judging eyes boring holes into that ridiculous too-bright floral print dress I'd snagged for $5 at a thrift store. I could practically hear the collective shudder from the clientele, the women dripping in real diamonds, the men in custom Italian wool, who saw me as some sort of visual pollutant contaminating their high-end bubble. And I knew exactly why they were staring. I didn't just look out of place. I looked like a mistake, a punchline that had accidentally wandered onto the stage of their serious, expensive lives. My cheap heels, the ones that clicked just a little too loud on the marble floor, and had that telltale scuff mark. I tried to cover with a black marker, felt like concrete blocks on my feet, anchoring me in a moment of acute, blinding humiliation. And I wanted nothing more than to melt into the polished floor and disappear before I had to utter another word or make another move that would further confirm their silent, accurate assessment of my financial and social status. The air in that room, thick with the scent of aged leather, expensive cologne, and subtle, dangerous ambition, suddenly felt too heavy to breathe, pressing down on my lungs and making me feel utterly small and exposed, like an animal caught under a spotlight, and the contrast between the effortless, immaculate perfection of everyone else in that room and the threadbare reality of my life had never been so painfully immediately apparent, crystallizing every insecurity I had spent years trying to suppress through sheer hard work and quiet resilience. The situation spiraled immediately. Just as I was trying to politely decline the velvet-upholstered chair Adrian was holding out for me, because a massive man in an aggressively tailored suit, who I later figured out was the head maitre d', came storming over with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt etched onto his face, demanding to know where my order was, and insisting I needed to use the service entrance for drop-offs. He didn't even pause for a breath. He just assumed without question that the only reason a person in this outfit would be standing in the middle of this ridiculously exclusive dining room was to deliver pizza, or maybe flowers, and his hand was already reaching out toward my shoulder, ready to physically steer me toward the kitchen before I could even explain that I was waiting for someone. It was the worst kind of dismissal, the kind that doesn't even bother to ask your name, the kind that judges your entire worth based on the cheap, frayed fabric clinging to your frame, and for a second, I felt that familiar hot rush of anger and helplessness that always came when I was reminded how little I mattered to the world with money. I could feel the sharp edge of his fingernails digging into my skin as he tried to subtly push me away, a humiliating physical rejection that was meant to be discreet but felt painfully public, confirming my worst fear that I was not only beneath their contempt, but a physical object to be moved and corrected, and I remember trying to articulate a coherent protest, struggling to push out the simple phrase, "I have a reservation." But the words caught in my throat, strangled by the sheer arrogance and conviction of his belief that I could only be low-status service staff. Before I could stutter out a defense, Adrian didn't raise his voice, he didn't even stand fully straight. But the maitre d' stopped dead mid-reach, freezing like a deer in headlights, because Adrian had done nothing more than lift one eyebrow and drop a low, steady sound from his throat. That wasn't a word, but a command that cut through the background music and the chatter of expensive people. That subtle, nonverbal communication, which was absolutely terrifying, even though it was aimed at someone else, was followed immediately by a clumsy, apologetic waiter, maybe rattled by the sudden shift in atmosphere, who, as fate would have it, was carrying a tray laden with water glasses. And just as I tried to subtly shift my weight to escape the tension, he tripped, sending a cascade of icy cold water, splashing directly onto the lower half of my already disastrous outfit. The floral dress, which was bad enough dry, immediately became a clingy, semi-transparent mess, and I just stood there dripping mortified, while the maitre d' frantically tried to dab at the mess with a pristine white napkin, all while Adrian simply watched the scene unfold with an unnerving stillness, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he was analyzing how I would react to this very specific, very public disaster. The cold shock of the water was momentarily overwhelming, making me gasp. But the true sting wasn't the temperature or the wetness. It was the realization that I was now an even bigger spectacle, an undeniable mess in a place that prized flawless surfaces, and I could feel my cheeks burning with a painful, intense heat that had nothing to do with the external temperature, wishing for nothing more than a trap door to swallow me whole and remove me from the epicenter of this elegant catastrophe. I felt the whispers hit me next, the collective judgment of the crowd, amplified by the silence Adrian's presence had imposed, and they weren't even trying to hide it. I could hear the hiss of comments from the adjacent VIP booth, where a collection of powerful-looking, intimidating figures, who were definitely not just regular business people judging by their watchful eyes and the way they held themselves, were exchanging looks of blatant amusement and disgust. One of them, a heavy-set man with a diamond pinky ring that probably cost more than my annual rent, muttered loud enough for the whole room to catch. Dressed like that, and she wants to go on a date here. What did the boss lose a bet? And another one chuckled a dry, humorless sound, adding, must be a charity case. Adrian's having a soft night, each word a sharp, cutting reminder that I was being measured, scrutinized, and found fundamentally lacking in every conceivable way, simply because of the worn-out state of my clothes, which they saw as a direct reflection of my character and ambition. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, echoing the silent, contemptuous judgment that I had experienced my entire life. The knowledge that people like me were disposable, and that my ambition to simply exist comfortably was inherently laughable to them. And I remember clenching my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack, channeling all the shame and anger into a tight, controlled knot in my stomach that was determined not to break, not in front of these people, not even for a spilled glass of water. It was in that moment, when the water was still cold on my skin, and the humiliation felt like a crushing weight that was about to buckle my knees, that I instinctively tightened my grip on the strap of my old canvas messenger bag, a gesture that was completely unconscious, but spoke volumes about my quiet resolve to not let these people see me break. I didn't meet their eyes. I simply focused on a point just above Adrian's shoulder, taking a slow, steady breath, trying to anchor myself in the quiet reality of my own integrity, which I knew was worth more than their entire collective net worth, even if the world saw it differently. I stood there shivering slightly from the cold water and the deep-seated embarrassment, utterly unprepared for the surreal turn of events that was unfolding, but also determined to get through it without shedding a single tear or allowing a single flicker of retreat to show on my face, because I refused to give these entitled, judgmental people the satisfaction of seeing me crumble under the weight of their petty cruelty. My focus narrowed entirely the opulent room, and the sneering faces fading into a blurry background, leaving only the sound of my own quiet, determined heartbeat, and the terrifying, unnerving stillness of the man standing opposite me. The man who held the key to my immediate survival, and somehow to a future I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And this is where I'm going to pause for just a moment, because what I'm telling you now, it's not just a story about a girl who got lucky. It's about holding on to yourself when everyone around you is telling you that you're worthless. And honestly, if this whole experience has taught me anything, it's that connection that finding your people is everything. So if you're watching this right now, please take a second, just a quick, easy pause, and open up your phone. Hit the like button on this video, leave me a quick comment below to let me know you're listening, and please subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing, but it helps me keep sharing these impossibly true stories with you, and I'd be honored if you'd walk this crazy road with me a little longer. The maitre d', feeling the lingering, terrifying weight of Adrian's disapproval, was finally regaining some of his composure, deciding to ignore the awkward silence and the obvious fact that I was now soaking wet in the middle of his pristine restaurant, and he was taking his final definitive step to escort me out, literally reaching out again to gently but firmly take my arm and usher me toward the exit when Adrian moved. It wasn't a quick, dramatic movement. It was slow, controlled, and utterly devastating in its effect, like watching a lion simply decide it's going to stretch. And he casually reached out and grasped my wrist, not roughly, but with a firm, inescapable grip, pulling me ever so slightly closer to his table. The gesture was possessive final, and it simultaneously drew every last eye in the room to the connection between his expensive cufflink and my bare cold skin, forcing every single person from the murmuring guests to the terrified waiter to reassess the situation entirely as he delivered the line that changed everything. "She's with me," Adrian stated, his voice now lower, colder than before, but completely devoid of any emotion, which made the statement terrifyingly authoritative, and the effect was immediate and absolute. The maitre d' instantly snatched his hand back, as if I were radiating hot electricity, and the other VIP guests, the ones who had been sneering just seconds ago, immediately dropped their gazes, a sudden forced look of intense interest now fixed upon their expensive plates of food or the rim of their wine glasses. This wasn't just a powerful man claiming a date. This was a sentence handed down by an undisputed authority, and the swiftness with which everyone complied. The abrupt silence, the lowered heads, the nervous adjustments of ties and skirts spoke volumes about the true intimidating weight of the Moretti name, even though Emily Hart had absolutely no idea what that name truly represented until that very moment. I stood there still dripping but suddenly untouchable, an ordinary girl transformed into an object of fear by the simple, unwavering hand gripping my wrist, realizing in a terrifying flash that I had gone from being ridiculed to being regarded with a deep, cautious reverence, simply because of the unexpected protective shadow of the man standing beside me. I couldn't help but pull back instinctively, shaking my head even though I knew the gesture was futile because the grip on my wrist didn't loosen even slightly. It simply tightened just enough to let me know that resistance was not an option right now, and I had to look Adrian right in the eye, trying to communicate with sheer force of will that he was making a profound, life-altering mistake. "You've got the wrong person," I whispered, my voice thick with residual shock and the lingering shame of the waiter incident, because my blind date was supposed to be a nice, quiet accountant named Mark, who drove a sensible Honda, not this terrifying, impeccably dressed man who seemed to have the power to stop hearts and halt conversations just by existing in a room. I was fully prepared for him to look at me, truly, look at the waterlogged floral dress and the cheap shoes, and realize his error, finally letting me go so I could flee to the nearest bus stop and forget this night ever happened. But his eyes, those intense, dark pools of nothing, only deepened their focus on my face, dismissing my protest with an unnerving certainty that made my panic feel utterly irrelevant to the powerful decision he had already made. Adrian, still holding my wrist, brought his other hand up and gently, almost clinically, tilted my chin up so that my eyes were forced to meet his, and he offered that same sharp, knowing half-smile that sent a strange combination of fear and heat through me, repeating his statement with an unwavering certainty that dismissed my panic entirely. "No." He said the word, a soft command that traveled only between the two of us. "You're exactly who I was waiting for." And then, just to push the boundaries of my already shattered reality, he let go of my wrist, gestured toward the soaked lower half of my dress, and asked in a tone of genuine, unnerving curiosity about the reason for my, shall we say, unconventional attire. I felt myself flush, but there was something in his gaze that demanded honesty, a brutal frankness that made lying seem pointless. So I swallowed hard, adjusted the strap of my canvas bag one last time, and admitted with a quiet, flat dignity that I wore old clothes not as a fashion statement, but simply to save money, because every spare dollar, every penny I could pinch went toward my sister Sienna's tuition and our crippling rent, and that was the unvarnished, shameful truth of my life. My throat felt tight as I spoke, not because I was ashamed of the poverty, but because I was exposing the raw vulnerability of my family's struggle to a man who measured worth in power, expecting him to finally see the commonness of my situation and turn away. I fully expected a laugh, a look of pity, or a wave of casual dismissal after that blunt admission, because that's what always happened when I spoke the truth of my poverty in front of people who had never worried about a grocery bill. But Adrian did something that genuinely stopped me in my tracks and momentarily made me forget the entire room. He actually smiled, a full, genuine, unexpected curve of the lips that wasn't cold or calculating, but contained a flicker of something warm and utterly human. A smile that looked like it hadn't been worn in years and was just now testing the air. And he simply said, "Honesty looks good on you." That was it. No judgment, no condescension, just a simple acknowledgement of my truth. And it hit me with the force of a revelation, a sudden blinding understanding that this man, this powerful, dangerous man who could have any woman in the world, wasn't looking for polish or performance. He was looking for something real, something unvarnished, and in my cheap floral dress and my raw, uncomfortable truth, he had unexpectedly found it making his decision right then and there to not just keep me for the night, but to pursue me into the complicated, terrifying world he occupied. The depth of that simple, genuine smile was unsettling, revealing a hidden crack in his formidable armor. And it was in that moment that I realized his interest was far more complex and dangerous than a simple, fleeting attraction. It was the intense, focused attention of a man who rarely lowers his guard, now fixated on something he couldn't immediately categorize or control. The immediate aftermath of being claimed by Adrian Moretti was less a fairy tale and more a whirlwind of pure chaotic disbelief as the next few days exploded with paparazzi flashes and screaming tabloid headlines that plastered my embarrassing picture right next to his stern, unreadable face, painting a narrative that was completely unrecognizable to me. The stories were vicious cutting and universally branded me as a cheap gold digger who had somehow, through some unknown trickery or ancient spell, managed to snag the most unattainable bachelor in the city's criminal underbelly, with headlines screaming things like, "The Floral Flop," "How a Woman Dressed for the Clearance Bin Landed the Moretti Fortune," and my face, pale and slightly damp from the spilled water, was dissected on social media with a cruelty reserved only for those who dare to trespass on territory far above their station. People who knew nothing about me decided my entire life story, my late nights spent coding graphics, my frantic efforts to cover Sienna's school books, was nothing more than a calculated move to access Adrian's immense wealth. And the sheer volume of hatred and judgment poured onto me felt like a physical weight heavier than the cold water ever had, a relentless, non-stop barrage of anonymous cruelty that followed me even into the assumed sanctuary of Adrian's secure penthouse, making me realize that being with him meant forfeiting any remaining piece of my private, quiet life forever. The sneering high society judgment wasn't confined to anonymous comments either. It spilled out into the real world with a venomous intensity, particularly when I was trying to navigate the lobby of Adrian's building, where, for reasons still confusing to me, I was now temporarily residing, since he insisted I couldn't go back to my place for my safety, a claim I hadn't yet fully processed. One afternoon, a trio of ridiculously overdressed women, society fixtures known for their generational wealth and aggressive Botox, literally blocked the entrance to the elevator, their designer bags like shields. And one of them, a blonde woman with a face set in a permanent look of disgusted superiority, leaned in close and whispered, her voice laced with pure distilled malice, "Someone like you, darling, is only fit to wash windows, not sit at a Moretti table," before pulling back and laughing, a sharp, unpleasant sound that was instantly joined by her companions, leaving me momentarily breathless and deeply wounded by the sheer unprovoked cruelty of their assessment. The blonde woman's perfume, sharp and overwhelmingly expensive, seemed to sting my nostrils, creating an immediate visceral link between the smell of privilege and the cold, unfeeling nature of their judgment. And I could feel the heat rising in my chest, a desperate, irrational need to defend the quiet dignity of my hard work against their effortless, inherited cruelty. I wanted to scream to defend myself, to tell them about the 3 jobs I was working about, the sacrifices I made for Sienna. But instead, I just adjusted my canvas bag, met her gaze with a quiet, steady stare that held no hostility, but immense, challenging dignity, and walked around them without saying a single word, my silence somehow feeling louder than their collective snickering, knowing that nothing I could say would ever pierce the thick armor of their entitlement. The fallout was devastating, hitting me exactly where it hurt the most. My professional life, the only thing I truly had control over, as email after email arrived, informing me that my freelance graphic design contracts were being abruptly terminated because of the unwanted scandal and the risk of association that my newfound unwanted fame now carried. These were stable clients, small businesses I'd worked with for years, and watching them vanish simply because of Adrian's sudden, inexplicable interest felt like watching my entire hard-won safety net dissolve into thin air, confirming every fear I'd ever harbored about the fragility of my position in the world. It wasn't just the money, though, that was a paralyzing fear in itself. It was the betrayal of trust, the instant assumption of guilt, and the clear message that my quiet, honest work was meaningless compared to the public spectacle of being linked, however unwillingly, to the notorious Adrian Moretti. The financial strain was immediate and terrifying, forcing me to rely on Adrian's protection, a dependence that gnawed at my self-respect, and reinforced the very gold-digger narrative I desperately wanted to refute, trapping me further in the gilded cage that his presence had created around me. I spent hours sitting at the edge of his massive panoramic windows, watching the city lights blur, feeling the cold emptiness of my bank account, and the profound loneliness of being completely misunderstood by everyone outside the immediate, complicated circle of his influence. Even my younger sister Sienna, the person I trusted most in the world, and the reason I worked so hard, looked at me with a profound, unsettling suspicion when I managed to sneak away for a brief, tense visit to our old apartment, her young face etched with worry that looked far too adult for her 17 years. She didn't read the tabloids, but she saw the fear in my eyes and the expensive, unfamiliar clothes Adrian had insisted I wear when I left his penthouse. And she cornered me in our tiny kitchen, holding my hands firmly as she delivered her own sharp, cutting warning. "Emily, something's wrong," she said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "Why would a man like that, a mafia boss, Emily? Why would he even look at you, let alone keep you close? You're smart, but you're too kind, and people like him don't just fall for kindness. You need to be careful. There's something he wants, and it's not just a date." Her suspicion, though based in love and a desperate need to protect me, stung more deeply than any tabloid headline, because it confirmed my own nagging, terrifying fear that this entire unbelievable scenario was a trap, and that Adrian's interest was a dangerous, ticking time bomb waiting to explode in my face. I could see the reflection of my own growing fear mirrored in her young eyes, the terror that I had traded our safety and security for a momentary dangerous fantasy, and the silent question in her gaze. "Are you going to be okay?" was a heavier burden than any public humiliation I had faced. I spent weeks operating under a cloud of deep paranoia, convinced that Adrian was simply biding his time, waiting for the moment to reveal his true nefarious purpose for keeping me close. But I was also watching him closely, and the more I watched, the more confused I became, because the man I saw behind the intimidating facade didn't quite match the monster painted by the press. One day he crashed a ridiculous high-end charity press event, the kind of nauseating spectacle where the same wealthy ladies who had sneered at me were loudly giving interviews about community and integrity. And he arrived unannounced, his presence instantly draining the air from the massive ballroom, forcing all conversation to an immediate, terrified halt. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply took the microphone from the host's hand, his expression utterly flat, and then in front of dozens of reporters and a live-streamed audience, he spoke about me, addressing the camera with a calm, deliberate intensity that made every lie about me feel utterly flimsy and ridiculous. The entire ballroom, previously buzzing with self-important chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses, became eerily silent, the only sound the hum of the spotlights and Adrian's deep, measured voice, and the atmosphere shifted from one of frivolous charity to one of profound, focused dread as everyone realized they were about to witness a display of power far exceeding the polite facade of their social gathering. The public seems to have a predefined narrative about the woman I choose to spend my time with. Adrian stated, his voice resonating with an undeniable quiet authority that silenced the entire breathlessly waiting crowd, and his eyes, which rarely showed anything, were completely locked onto the camera, giving the impression that he was speaking directly to every single person who had ever judged me. You call her a gold digger, a user, someone after my money, but I am here to tell you that this entire assumption is fundamentally incorrect. He continued, holding the suspense for a beat that felt like an eternity, before dropping the line that completely shifted the earth beneath my feet. She doesn't need my money. He declared, his voice suddenly thick with an unexpected, almost raw honesty. I'm the one who needs her. It was a confession, a claim, and a declaration of war all wrapped up in one, and the sheer audacity of the statement. The public ownership he took over our impossible relationship left the entire room and me utterly speechless, watching the faces of the society. Women turn pale with the sudden, terrifying realization that they had fatally miscalculated and publicly insulted the one person Adrian Moretti truly valued. Then, just to drive the point home, he played a short, silent video clip that he had managed to project onto the massive screen behind him, footage that, judging by the grainy quality and the angle, must have been taken covertly. And it showed a moment from a few weeks ago, after a minor accident, where I'd scratched the expensive door of his ridiculously expensive vintage car in the parking garage. The video clearly showed him handing me a thick envelope of cash, insisting it was for the damage, but it also showed me pushing the money back, my head shaking firmly, explaining that I would pay for the repair out of my next freelance check, however long that took, because I refused to owe him a single cent. A refusal that he clearly remembered and now wielded as irrefutable proof of my character. The room gasped. The society ladies' smug expressions crumbled into looks of stunned, horrified realization, their carefully constructed facades cracking as they understood the severe consequences of their earlier snubs. And Adrian simply stood there, letting the silence and the undeniable evidence dismantle every vicious lie that had been printed about me, demonstrating his fierce, protective loyalty in a way that was as calculated as it was heartfelt. The power of that simple, honest rejection, my refusal to take his money, was magnified 1,000 times in that setting, turning my humble integrity into the most potent weapon Adrian could have deployed publicly, humiliating his detractors by showing them that the woman they scorned possessed a moral code far superior to their own. Later that evening, Adrian took me deep into his massive penthouse, guiding me past an intimidating security setup and into a room I had never seen before. A small windowless chamber behind a thick reinforced steel door, which contained not just sensitive business documents, but also a terrifying amount of surveillance equipment, monitors flickering with live feeds from various locations around the city. The room felt like the true heart of his empire, cold and purely functional, and for a moment I was sure the real reason for his entire public display was about to be revealed, that he would finally admit he was investigating me, that I was a pawn in some larger, darker game. But instead of showing me a file, he walked over to a small corkboard hidden in the corner, gently peeling off a single, slightly wrinkled printout that had been tacked up with a pushpin, and he handed it to me without a word. The air in that hidden room was thick with the silent hum of technology and the cold reality of his life, a stark contrast to the luxurious warmth of the rest of the penthouse, and I felt a chilling sense of foreboding as I took the photograph from his hand, knowing that whatever he was about to reveal would shatter the last illusions I held about our strange connection. It was a photo of me taken on the very first day, the day of the blind date disaster, but it wasn't the humiliating tabloid shot. This was a candid, slightly blurred picture taken from a distance, capturing the exact moment the waiter had spilled the water on me. In the photo, I wasn't weeping or running. I was standing completely still, my eyes fixed forward, my hand tightened on the strap of my canvas bag, the quiet dignity in my posture undeniable even in the middle of the mess. I felt the breath catch in my throat as I looked from the photo to his face, a sudden blinding realization hitting me. And Adrian, seeing the moment of clarity, finally broke the silence, his voice dropping to a low, raw murmur that seemed almost painful for him to utter. I noticed you long before you knew my name, Emily. He confessed, and it wasn't a romantic declaration, but an admission of a strategic blunder turned into an emotional obsession. The terrifying truth that he had initially had me watched suspecting I was linked to a mistaken assassination case because of a faulty piece of intelligence. But the more he watched, the more he was drawn in by the quiet, resilient honesty of my life, until the investigation became something much more personal, much more dangerous. He explained that his former intelligence had been looking for a woman with a similar physical description who was thought to be moving documents for a rival, and when he saw the surveillance feed of me in the restaurant, his initial reaction was purely professional, but then he witnessed the integrity of my reaction to the humiliation, the refusal to break or react with expected subservience, and that unexpected strength. The quiet resolve in my eyes had been the single factor that made him overrule his security team's advice to simply have me eliminated as a potential risk. The revelation of Adrian's initial surveillance was a massive, unsettling shock, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sudden, terrifying escalation of the war being waged against him by his longtime rival, Viktor Baranov, a cold, ruthless Russian kingpin whose actions were designed not just to hurt Adrian's business, but to dismantle his emotional defenses, which Viktor rightly recognized as having suddenly centered around me. Viktor's attack was surgical and cruel, starting with the immediate leaking of my most painful, deeply buried financial secrets, records of my being sued for unpaid college tuition. From years ago, a debt I had been scrambling for years to pay off, were suddenly public, turning a humiliating but necessary chapter of my life into a weapon used to mock my character. They published the exact figures, the name of the community college, and even the humiliating details of the judge's order, framing it all as proof that I was a woman with a desperate, crippling history of failure, who was now clearly seizing the opportunity to exploit Adrian's fortune. My history of working 3 different service jobs simultaneously, just to keep Sienna in school and the lights on, was twisted by Baranov's media proxies and social media attack dogs who painted me as a desperate, pathetic figure, a woman whose entire existence was defined by her failure and her desperate attempts to claw her way out of the gutter, rather than a person who valued her self-sufficiency above all else. The cruelty reached a terrifying peak when Viktor's goons started following Sienna, not aggressively or physically threatening, but subtly, a dark, unmistakable presence outside her school and near our old apartment building. A clear, terrifying message intended to pressure me by targeting the one person Adrian knew I would sacrifice everything for. Sienna, who was already suspicious, became withdrawn and terrified, refusing to leave the apartment. The bright, vibrant curiosity that usually defined her replaced by a deep, cautious fear that made her constantly check over her shoulder, even within the confines of our old, humble kitchen. The sight of her eating dinner with the blinds tightly drawn, her phone constantly vibrating with blocked numbers and anonymous threats, was a cold, paralyzing weight in my chest, completely overshadowing my own safety concerns and making me feel like the absolute worst kind of sister, the one whose presence had inadvertently brought danger to the person she was meant to protect. It was a brilliant, wicked tactic by Viktor, hitting the exact weak point he'd identified, and it worked perfectly, driving a wedge of distrust and panic deep into my relationship with Adrian, who was struggling to contain the escalating violence against his operation, knowing that every moment I remained close to him, the danger to Sienna increased exponentially. The ultimate betrayal came not from Viktor but from within Adrian's own circle, fueled by the relentless pressure and the accusations that I was a spy planted inside the Moretti Empire, someone whose obvious poverty made me easily corrupted, and therefore a security risk. The suspicion was so intense that Adrian was forced to react, and he called me into his main office, the place where all his major decisions were made, and in front of a dozen of his most trusted, most terrifying men, including his cold, watchful second-in-command, Leon Russo, he subjected me to a harsh, cold, clinical interrogation that felt like a public execution. He didn't use violence. He used words, probing my past, asking impossible questions about my college debt, demanding to know who I had spoken to recently. And the look in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, calculating suspicion that eclipsed the earlier warmth, was what truly broke my heart. making me realize that despite all his grand public declarations deep down, the Mafia boss still saw me as a liability, a potential threat, and nothing more than a cheap pawn he might have to discard. I stood there utterly defenseless, and exposed the quiet betrayal of his distrust washing over me like a tidal wave, wanting nothing more than to walk out and never look back, but knowing I couldn't leave Sienna exposed to Victor's growing menace, and the heavy, silent judgment of Adrian's men felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, trying to force me to finally crumble under the strain. I felt the urge to flee to protect myself and Sienna by disappearing entirely, but the moment I heard Adrian being interrogated by his own men later that night, I knew running wasn't an option. I had to fight back, not with guns or money, but with the quiet, resourceful intelligence that was the only weapon I had ever truly possessed. I was pretending to organize some old papers in a supply room adjacent to his private conference room, a room with excellent acoustics and a very thin wall, and I overheard one of Victor's frantic, encrypted calls being played back over a security loop, a call where Victor was gloating about the crippling effects of his recent attacks, and crucially making a subtle reference to a special drive containing the final evidence of his involvement in the assassinations of several of Adrian's loyal high-ranking men. The location was a massive casino Victor owned on the edge of the city, a fortress that felt impenetrable, but the detail I caught the reference to a specific service elevator and a routine cleaning shift on the 48th floor sparked a terrifying, reckless idea in my mind, a sudden surge of adrenaline and resolve replacing the paralyzing fear. Within 48 hours, I had devised a plan, one that relied entirely on the fact that I was so fundamentally forgettable and low status that no one would ever truly see me when I was standing right in front of them, a strength I had honed over years of scraping by. I used my skills as a graphic designer to forge a passable, temporary ID badge for a major cleaning contractor, traded my Adrian-mandated expensive clothes for a pair of ill-fitting gray cleaning overalls, and with my faithful canvas bag tucked away in a locker, I slipped into the belly of Victor's casino fortress during the dead of night, looking exactly like what everyone already assumed I was invisible service staff. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but the shame of the public interrogation had burned away, all my fear leaving only a clear, focused determination. And I moved through the silent, massive casino floors, past the surveillance cameras and the bored security guards, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her whole life going unnoticed, using that very anonymity as my shield. The smell of disinfectant and stale, expensive cigars was overwhelming, a fitting backdrop for the illicit activities hidden beneath the veneer of luxury. And I had several close calls, once having to quickly duck behind a service cart as two massive security guards paused to exchange a casual word, their eyes passing right over me, as if I were simply a fixture in the cleaning crew. It was terrifyingly easy to navigate the back corridors, the path illuminated only by the dull, flickering safety lights, until I reached the small, reinforced service room Victor used as his temporary command center, following the specific audio cue I'd memorized from the intercepted call. The room itself was chaotic, a mix of high-tech communication gear and cheap discarded furniture, and following a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the wall that matched the description in the recording. I managed to locate the safe hidden behind a cheap painting of a pastoral scene that seemed ludicrously out of place where the crucial USB drive was stored. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the lock-picking tool, a tiny piece of metal I'd bought online and practiced with for 2 frantic hours. But the image of Sienna's terrified, withdrawn face was the only thing I allowed myself to focus on, and that fierce, protective love drove me forward until I heard the subtle, satisfying click of the lock yielding. I snagged the drive, a cheap, nondescript black plastic rectangle, and slipped it into the zippered pocket of my overalls, not bothering to close the safe, deciding that the chaos of the immediate discovery would be a better cover for my eventual escape. And then I reversed my steps, melting back into the shadows of the service hallways, feeling the heavy, cold weight of that tiny piece of plastic that held the fate of 2 empires and the safety of my sister. The drive felt like a key not to wealth, but to Adrian's undeniable immediate respect, and more importantly to the protection I needed for Sienna. The walk back to Adrian's penthouse was a blur of heightened senses and paranoid glances, every passing car feeling like a potential threat. but the adrenaline only intensified when I finally stood before Adrian in the cold, sterile environment of his office, with the heavy, silenced presence of Leon Russo, his right-hand man standing watchfully nearby. I didn't announce the drive. I simply pulled it from my pocket and slammed it onto the glass surface of his desk, the sound echoing loudly in the sudden deep silence of the room. And then I met his eye. My posture straight and unwavering, the quiet dignity that people always overlooked, now radiating with a fierce, unmistakable power. Adrian, who had been reviewing some documents, looked up, a flicker of confusion and warning in his eyes. But before he could utter a word, I delivered my terms, the condition that had driven me to risk everything, the one thing no one in his world would ever have dared to do. This drive contains everything. I stated, my voice low and steady, a slight tremor the only indication of the chaos raging inside me. Proof of Baronov's betrayal, and the means to destroy him, I assume, but I need you to understand something very clearly. I took a single step closer to the desk, closing the physical distance between us, forcing him to meet the full, unblinking intensity of my gaze, and I delivered the single, non-negotiable condition I had set for this act of loyalty and intelligence. Protect my sister first. I said the words heavy with command. Protect Sienna, get her out of the city, and make sure she is completely, irrevocably safe before you even think about using the information on that drive. Adrian's expression, usually a mask of impenetrable control, fractured momentarily, revealing a deep, profound stun, a shock that Leon Russo also visibly shared, because the sheer nerve of a low-status woman setting terms with the head of the Moretti Empire was an act of boldness that shattered every rule of their brutal hierarchical world, a testament to the fact that I had learned to fight not with emotion or violence, but with intelligence, and the one thing I valued more than life itself. The air in the room seemed to crackle with the silent transfer of power, Adrian's usual dominance momentarily suspended by the quiet, absolute authority of my condition, the unspoken message being that my loyalty was earned, not given, and that my price was not money but the safety of my family. Adrian's decision to move his sister immediately, even before fully processing the contents of the drive, cemented a new level of grudging respect from his men, but it did nothing to silence the whispers that now intensified, taking on a tone of near mutiny as they watched their powerful, ruthless boss become increasingly centered around the safety of one small, seemingly insignificant woman. "The boss has gone crazy? He's really in love," the men murmured in the hallways, their voices carrying the cold, hard judgment of professionals who saw affection as a lethal weakness, a clear sign that Adrian was losing his necessary edge in a world where sentiment meant certain death. They started to question Leon Russo's loyalty, wondering why he permitted such a gross deviation from protocol, and their murmurs grew louder, fueled by a mixture of deep-seated misogyny and professional survival instincts, viewing me as the soft spot, the fatal flaw in Adrian's seemingly perfect defense. The disdain wasn't just limited to the lower ranks. The powerful old guard Mafia Council, a collection of aging conservative men who valued tradition and bloodless calculation above all else, convened an emergency meeting, declaring with chilling collective agreement that Moretti is losing his edge because of a woman. The judgment delivered with a severity that carried a threat of its own, an implication that Adrian's softening heart made him unfit to rule, and that they were prepared to take necessary steps to correct the unstable leadership before it led to the family's total collapse. The judgment reached a deadly climax during a routine, or so I thought, evening drive through the city, which was Adrian's brief moment of calculated relaxation, a time he insisted I share with him. And we were stopped at a traffic light when the world suddenly exploded into a terrifying, chaotic mess of shattering glass, metallic screams, and deafening gunfire. An assassination attempt, brutal and highly organized, hit the side of the car closest to Adrian, and the thick armored glass saved our lives, but the sheer concussive force of the impact was like a physical punch, leaving my ears ringing and my body paralyzed with shock as Adrian's security detail immediately swarmed the vehicle, returning fire with lethal, terrifying efficiency. The stench of gunpowder and scorched metal immediately filled the interior, acrid and suffocating, and I instinctively ducked down, my hands flying to my head, the sound of the automatic fire so close and visceral that it felt like it was tearing the air right beside my ear, and for a terrifying moment the reality of the danger was so overwhelming that I thought I might black out. When the immediate danger subsided, and Adrian, calm and collected, emerged from the wreckage, he was bleeding from a shallow graze on his arm, a light wound easily treated, but one that was immediately scrutinized by his already suspicious men, who saw the spilled blood as undeniable proof of my dangerous influence. The reaction from his men as they bandaged Adrian's arm and surveyed the destroyed vehicle was instant, and cutting a wave of silent, accusatory stares directed solely at me, their eyes holding the clear, unspoken accusation that I was bad luck, that my presence was making the boss lose his fear factor, eroding the impenetrable aura of invincibility that had kept him alive for 2 decades. Leon Russo, who was usually reserved, met my gaze with a look that wasn't hateful, but utterly cold, a professional judgment that said, "You are the variable that cost him blood." I didn't need words to understand the gravity of their silent condemnation. I could feel the cold, hard logic of their world closing in around me, the undeniable fact that every time I was near Adrian, the danger around him escalated, and the sight of his bloodied arm, however minor the injury, was the final, undeniable proof that my quiet love for him was an existential threat to his life and his empire. The self-blame was immediate and overwhelming, a crushing certainty that I was directly responsible for the chaos, and in that moment, shivering in the wreckage of the armored car, I knew with a chilling clarity that the only way to genuinely protect Adrian, the only way to silence the whispers and restore his necessary edge, was to leave him entirely, to disappear back into the anonymity that was my only real defense, even if the thought of walking away felt like tearing a vital organ from my own body. I began making my quiet preparations to leave that very night, not announcing my intentions, but simply consolidating the few belongings I still possessed, waiting for the cover of dawn to slip away, convinced that this final painful sacrifice was the last act of love I could offer Adrian Moretti. I was packed, dressed in simple, anonymous clothing, and standing by the elevator in the massive, echoing penthouse, my canvas messenger bag clutched tightly to my chest, when the doors opened and Adrian was standing there blocking my escape, his eyes immediately taking in the packed bag and my determined yet miserable expression. He didn't shout or demand explanations. He simply walked out of the elevator, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any outburst, and he took the bag from my hands, tossing it carelessly onto the marble floor, before taking my hand and pulling me firmly, but gently back, toward the living room, heading not toward his office, but toward the main panoramic windows that overlooked the waking city. His grip on my hand was warm, but it was absolute, a silent refusal to accept my impending departure, and I could feel the tension radiating off him, a fierce, contained emotion that made the air feel electrified like a gathering storm. Before I could stutter out my desperate explanation about protecting him and being his liability, he stopped abruptly, turning to face me with an intensity that felt like a physical blow, and without saying a word, he led me straight out of the penthouse and into the early morning street, ignoring the protests of his bewildered bodyguards, pulling me through the dawn-lit city until we reached the middle of a massive, rain-soaked intersection. The early morning rain was cold and sharp on my face, blurring the skyscrapers and the neon signs, and I was shivering, emotionally and physically exhausted, when Adrian suddenly dropped my hand, and in an act that defied everything I knew about the fearsome, controlled Mafia boss, he dropped to one knee right there in the pouring rain, in the middle of a major street, his clothes instantly soaking and clinging to his powerful frame. It was a gesture so public, so unexpected, so utterly against the cold, calculated image he cultivated, that it stopped me dead. The sudden, raw vulnerability of the moment, completely overwhelming the need for escape, causing me to forget my fear, my shame, and even the relentless cold of the rain, focusing entirely on the sheer impossibility of the scene unfolding before me. "You think you're my weakness?" Adrian's voice, usually a low, controlled rumble, was now thick with emotion, sounding utterly raw against the relentless sound of the rain, and he looked up at me, his gaze fierce and unwavering, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. "You've got it backwards, Emily." He continued, pulling a small velvet box from his soaked jacket pocket, the action of retrieving it as clumsy and imperfect as a man who rarely allowed himself such public display of feeling. "You're not my weakness." He declared the words ringing with a final, undeniable truth that cut through the noise of the city and the fear in my heart. "You're the only thing keeping me human." He didn't wait for my answer. He just opened the box, revealing a massive, incredibly complex antique ring, a heavy, ornate piece of gold set with a single dark stone that I immediately recognized as the unmistakable Moretti signet, a symbol of power and absolute ownership. And he took my left hand, slipping the ring onto my finger right there in the downpour. The cold metal sliding onto my skin felt like a brand, a permanent, undeniable link to his dangerous world, but the weight of it was strangely comforting, a tangible representation of the monumental sacrifice he was making to claim me in the most public way possible, transforming me from a liability into a fortress. As he stood up, his gaze swept past me, fixing with lethal certainty on the sudden, frantic clicks of paparazzi cameras that had inevitably found us even in the early morning rain, and with a raw, terrifying intensity that transformed his confession of love into a declaration of open warfare, Adrian delivered the final chilling edict. "From today," he announced, his voice amplified by the rain-slicked silence and aimed directly at the hidden lenses, "touch her, and you're declaring war on me, on the entire Moretti name." It wasn't a proposal. It was a unilateral act of protection, a desperate maneuver to make me a sacred, untouchable asset in the eyes of his enemies and his allies alike, forcing the entire underworld to acknowledge that I was now a part of the family structure, someone whose injury would be treated as an act of treason against the Moretti throne, and the significance of that heavy ring on my finger was not love, but a terrifying absolute shield of power. The press immediately scattered, realizing the gravity of the public declaration, and I stood there shivering, watching the receding headlights, realizing Adrian hadn't just proposed marriage. He had established a new deadly red line in his empire, making my survival central to his own power, daring his enemies to challenge the very thing he chose to prioritize over all else. The immediate aftermath of Adrian's public display was a brief, confusing lull, a period where everyone from the council to Viktor Baranov was forced to recalculate the implications of my new frightening status. But the respite was short-lived, because Viktor was too deeply invested in dismantling Adrian to be deterred by a simple engagement ring. The final brutal test arrived, not with a bomb or a bullet, but with a sudden, terrifying silence, when I realized my security detail, the men Adrian had assigned to me, were nowhere to be found. And the last thing I remember was a sickeningly sweet scent of chloroform, a rough hand clapping over my mouth, and the world dissolving into a dark, paralyzing emptiness. When I woke up, the air was cold and stale, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and damp concrete, and I found myself tied securely to a rickety wooden chair in the middle of what looked like a derelict warehouse. The cold, heavy gaze of Viktor Baranov fixed on me from across the room, the single overhead light bulb casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the deep, sickening fear pooling in my stomach. The ropes were rough, digging painfully into my wrists, and the adrenaline only intensified the realization that Viktor had managed to neutralize Adrian's protection, turning me back into the small, disposable girl everyone always assumed I was. Viktor didn't waste time on pleasantries. He immediately began a cruel, calculating live stream directed straight to Adrian, his face a mask of triumphant, cold malice as he delivered the ultimatum that marked the final, desperate stage of their war. "Choose Moretti," Viktor sneered into the camera, his voice carrying clearly through the cavernous space. "Your throne or your woman?" And the camera panned to me, tied up, exposed, and utterly terrified, while Viktor's men laughed, a harsh, derisive sound, as they mocked me, the woman Adrian had risked everything for, calling me a cheap pawn and a pitiful floral accessory. Every word they uttered, every sneer they delivered, hammered home the point that I was nothing, that Adrian's sacrifice was meaningless. And the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that I was merely a bargaining chip in a high-stakes, deadly game completely broke the last remaining vestiges of my composure. I could hear the faint, mocking echo of the society ladies' laughter in my mind, their earlier condemnation now magnified 1,000 times by the terrifying reality of Viktor's gun, confirming their belief that I was, and always would be, disposable. As Viktor started his slow, agonizing countdown, holding a heavy silver-plated pistol, aimed casually at my head, I felt the cold fear turn into a desperate, racking despair. The tears finally starting to flow down my cheeks, blurring the concrete walls and the cruel, expectant faces of his men. I knew Adrian was powerful. I knew he loved me in his strange, terrifying way. But the empire, the decades of power, the weight of the Moretti name, the very thing that defined his life, that was everything, and the cold, hard logic of the underworld dictated that he would choose his throne. I closed my eyes, accepting the final, inevitable truth that I was about to die. A small, sad footnote in the war, between two dangerous men, convinced that Adrian couldn't dare to sacrifice the absolute power he had lived and breathed for his entire life, and the counting continued, slow measured, each number, an inexorable step closer to my final, lonely end. The silence from the live stream on Victor's side was deafening, a terrifying sign that Adrian hadn't instantly responded, and the brief, torturous delay was the final confirmation of my deepest fear that the Empire always wins, and that my life was simply too small a price to demand such a world-altering sacrifice from a man like Adrian Moretti. The counting stopped dead at 3. Not because Victor chose to stop, but because the heavy steel door at the far end of the warehouse blew inward with an earth-shattering explosion, followed by a torrent of smoke dust and shrapnel, announcing Adrian's arrival with a deafening, terrifying finality. He stepped into the chaotic mess alone, his expensive suit now dusty and slightly singed his face, a mask of pure, focused, terrifying rage. A man who had clearly crossed the line from powerful boss to something feral and utterly unleashed, and every single one of Victor's men, hardened killers, though they were visibly hesitated, recognizing the sheer, suicidal audacity of his solitary presence. The warehouse immediately filled with a tension thicker than the smoke, all eyes fixed on Adrian, who didn't raise his voice or draw a weapon, but simply walked slowly toward the center of the room, fixing Victor with a gaze of such lethal, controlled hatred that it seemed to burn his silent, purposeful advance, signaling a devastation far worse than any immediate gunfire. "I choose her." Adrian said the two words delivered with a quiet, final certainty that immediately sealed his fate and destroyed his empire. And as soon as the words left his lips, a second, massive, far more distant explosion rattled the entire building, followed by the distant wail of alarms and sirens signaling the systematic, brutal destruction of Victor's strategic backup armory, the hidden cache of weapons and resources that he had spent 20 years meticulously building. Adrian had made his choice, irrevocably destroying the very foundation of Victor's power, to make a point demonstrating to the entire underworld that he was willing to obliterate his own future to save me. And Victor, realizing the terrifying extent of Adrian's commitment, snarled in fury, pulling the trigger on the pistol aimed at my head, a desperate final attempt to win something from the wreckage. The sound of the second explosion, deep and concussive, confirmed that Adrian's sacrifice was real, that he had traded his throne for my life, and that final terrifying realization gave me a sudden fierce rush of clarity and purpose, extinguishing the last remnants of my fear. But in that split second as the hammer fell, my body moved with a sudden instinctual ferocity, born of adrenaline and pure self-preservation, and my eyes, which had been fixed on the gun, caught the glint of a piece of shattered glass from a broken window lying just within reach. With a violent, desperate wrench, I pulled my tied hands just enough to snag the sharp edge, and just as the gun fired, the deafening sound echoing off the concrete walls, I plunged the jagged shard into Victor's wrist. The shock of the sudden, unexpected pain, causing his shot to go wildly astray, grazing my shoulder, but failing to kill me. The sudden, intense pain made my head swim, but the momentary distraction was all I needed. The cords around my wrists, weakened by the razor-sharp glass, finally snapped, and I kicked the chair out from under me, falling hard, but instantly scrambling toward the fallen gun, my movements fueled by a desperation that canceled out the pain. My years of quiet resilience now manifesting as a raw, untamed fight for survival. Adrian, who had tackled 2 of Victor's men, and was now lying on the ground severely wounded from the crossfire, but still fiercely focused on me, watched with a look of stunned pride as I snatched the pistol from the ground, my hands trembling violently, and leveled it directly at Victor, who was clutching his bleeding wrist and scrambling for his own dropped weapon. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I simply pulled the trigger, the final decisive shot ringing out with a terrifying clarity that ended the war, silenced the room, and solidified my impossible journey from a mocked cheap pawn to the one who had finally eliminated the threat. As Viktor Baranov fell, the silence returned thick and absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing and the distant growing wail of police sirens. And I stood there, shaking the heavy pistol still smoking in my hand, before my knees buckled and I collapsed onto the cold, damp concrete beside the gravely wounded Adrian, the blood from his wound mixing with the sweat and the rain on the floor. Adrian's breath was shallow, his eyes fluttering, and as I desperately ripped a piece of fabric from my dress to staunch the bleeding on his side, he reached up a weak, shaking hand and gently cupped my cheek, his eyes still filled with that deep, unnerving intensity, softening into something warm and utterly peaceful. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching me, taking in the blood and the tears and the sheer raw determination on my face. And then, with the very last whisper of his strength, he delivered the final words that closed the circle of our insane, impossible love story. "You didn't dress right for our first date," he whispered, his thumb tracing the tear tracks on my cheek, the familiar slight smile playing on his lips. "But you were perfect for my last breath." He wasn't ready to let go yet, but in that moment, in that blood-soaked wreckage, I understood our love, the one that everyone mocked and saw as a weakness, had become the only force strong enough to bring down an entire empire and redefine the cost of power. I realized then that I was never small, never insignificant, and that my quiet strength had always been enough even when the world told me otherwise. The pain of the past was finally replaced by the quiet, resolute strength of the present, and I knew I would carry this truth with me always. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.